I have to be honest, I don't have a presentation or a PowerPoint ready for you. We're going to go through a little bit of a spreadsheet that I started to put together here several months ago. Glenn and I talked about it, and I'll tell you kind of the onus for putting this together. As you can see from Kevin's presentation, we're going to have, as I look into my crystal ball looking forward, we're going to have more and more of a need to take manure from where it's produced out to farther and farther sites. I spent the last 6 years of my professional career looking strictly at the distressed watershed rules in Grand Lake St. Mary's and implementing them. As part of that, we've obviously got a lot of manure in that small area, and we needed to evaluate for livestock producers how much it actually does cost to take manure and transfer it farther away from the production site. We tried talking about doing that with tankers and tractors or liquid spreaders and tractors. Very quickly we run out of time and it gets way too expensive real quick. So one thing that has developed for us over there in West Central Ohio over the last 5 years is we've got a couple of different folks that have got manure tanks behind semis, and we're taking that manure and we're transferring it. To be perfectly honest, the first couple of nutrient management plans that we wrote where we had swine manure traveling 15 miles one way, my opinion was, yeah, that guy's telling us what we want to hear. This will never actually happen. To the landowner's credit, it actually happened. I happened to be going to work one day, going up 127, and I followed a semi-load full of manure, taking the corner and going out east of the watershed. Hey, that's actually happening. So we started to actually look at it. I talked to some of those folks last week, and if we look at what that truck and tanker cost, I mean, really all we're doing is buying a service. You just got to have the availability of it. The truck and the driver cost about $100 an hour. It was $95 here about 6 months ago. I called them earlier this week, and they're saying that currently they're charging $100 an hour. It might be going up to $105 next year. We'll have to see. Obviously, if we're looking at that, we got to boil this whole thing down, this whole application down to hours. We got to look at time. How often can we take that truck and make that truck make a circuit? So we're going to look at some things like our load time. You're going to have to hit escape for me a couple times every time I'm hitting this pointer. We're going to have to look up here at load time. That load time, as well as the unload time or the application time, that's going to be the time that you're pulling off the road into the farm or into the field and then back out the lane onto the road again. That's your load time. It's not the time that the truck is actually sitting there stopped, loading with manure. Because obviously, going through the field and going up the lane, we're not going to average any kind of real speed. So we got to look at our load times. We got to look at our average road speed. Stop signs are the biggest enemy of making this work. Because a few stop signs in your route are going to kill your average road speed. So for starting, for today's discussion, I plugged in 30 miles per hour as an average road speed. And we're looking at a distance to the field of 25. Glenn, could you change that? Just change that back to, say, make that 15 if you would. So we got a distance to the field of 15 miles. We're saying that we're using the landowner's equipment to load the spreader. Our load volume, 6,500 gallons per load. That might be pushing the legal limit a little bit. And we're going to put in a target application rate. That target application rate has nothing to do with the cost now at this point, but it does have some implications a little bit later on. So if you could, Glenn, scroll down on that page. So we're taking this manure, we're putting it in a truck, we're taking it out to the field, and we're going to apply this manure to the field outside the back of the truck. So what does that relate to? Well, if we look at that 15 miles, we look at an average road speed of 30 miles per hour, and we look at a loading time and an unloading time combined of 12 minutes, that means it takes us 72 minutes to make that round trip. At 72 minutes and at $100 an hour, that means that our hauling costs are then $120 per load. If we're applying it at that 5,000 gallons per acre, we've just covered that each acre for $92.31. And our hauling cost, this is the number that's important to me, is about 1.8 to 1.9 cents per gallon. Well, why is that important? because we do have several discussions about manure processing technology going on in the state of Ohio and nationally. For what we're looking at in Grand Lake, for what we're looking at in Lake Erie, the biggest part of that processing cost is going to be focused on taking phosphorus out of that liquid manure. I have yet to find a technology where our processing cost alone to pull the phosphorus out of that liquid manure is less than 1.5 cents per gallon. There might be some other ones that if you scale them up high enough, you can get there. But for our local farms, there hasn't been a one that would do the job for less than 1.5 pennies a gallon. Well, for 1.8 cents, I've taken that manure, I've hauled it, and I've applied it. If I spend 1.5 pennies per gallon to process the manure, I still have to get rid of some solids, assuming that we got a solid product where we're going to have the phosphorus in, and we still have to do some land application of liquid manure or liquid waste. So that leaves us maybe, if we're going to compete with this, about 0.3 cents to apply the liquids and to ship the solids off. So, the end message is, for 2 pennies a gallon, if you can have a decent route and you get pretty efficient at loading and unloading this, you can actually truck that manure pretty darn far. We've got several producers down there close to me where they're going one way in the range of 20 to 22 miles on their own ground, and they're making it work. They're coming up with about a zero balance on this. So, it is possible. It is possible to put some of this manure in a tanker and send it down the road and roll it down the road. It can make sense. We've also, this was Glenn's request, and this spreadsheet is a work in progress, but we've also taken the same thing and said, okay, if we had some alternate application going on at the field, how many trucks would it take to tender that application? So, I think up on the slides here, we've got a field application rate. So if we had a frac tank and a pump out in the field where we were taking it through a drag line and injecting it directly, say we have 850 gallons a minute going out there at the field, how many trucks would it take to keep that frac tank moving? So that would take 10 trucks to keep that moving, which is a lot of trucks, to be perfectly honest. That means at that point in time, you're spending $1,000 an hour to tender this process, plus whatever the process is going to cost you out in the field. That part might not make as much sense. Especially if we start to take that 850 gallons per minute and crank it up to a more conventional number for a drag line, which would be 1,000, 1,200, 1,500 gallons a minute. The number of trucks required to do that are probably going to start to become unreasonable. However, simplest form, applying that manure out of the back of the truck at 5,000 gallons per acre is doable today, and it's not as expensive as what I would have once thought. So, we got some information here. Well, let's take it to the next step. Can we use this spreadsheet to start a conversation between our livestock producer who has manure and potentially doesn't have ground, and a crop producer who has ground and needs nutrients of some sort? So, Glenn, if you could, pan over to the other side of that spreadsheet. We're going to go through some nutrient analysis on this. There you go, and then I'll back up to the top. So what I did for this part of it is we've got an average of about 90 or so swine manure samples that we've got as a result of these distressed watershed rules. And I took that average and plugged them in. For our nutrient values, I went ahead and looked at Van Tilburg's site this morning. And the price of N coming through 28 at the farm or delivered to your farm was 32 cents a pound. Phosphate, 36 cents a pound. Potash, 27. And sulfur, if you need it, 33 cents a pound. The biggest thing that's important in this calculation is trying to figure out some sort of ammonia availability. Any benefit that we can derive and any value that we have in shipping this manure down the road is going to probably be very dependent on taking advantage of that nitrogen that you have in that manure. But given the analysis that we have and given those values, Glenn, if you could scroll down a little bit, we can start to look at some things like this. So, as far as our nutrients applied, assuming that 5,000 gallons per acre, 75% of that ammonia is available to us, given on my assumption, That means we got about 130 pounds of available nitrogen coming through that manure. And for those of you who are into figuring plant available nitrogen, I assumed a third of the organic nitrogen was going to be available that following year, or following the application. We got about 111 pounds of phosphate available, 133 pounds of potash, and some 17 odd pounds of sulfur. If we add all of those up and include the charge that if we're going to compare this to commercial fertilizer, we also got to kick in the cost that it takes to actually apply the fertilizer. So again, looking at Van Tilburg's rates, they were charging a flat fee for a fertilizer spreader of $5 per acre. That puts us a total value of those nutrients as applied at $128 per acre. Keep in mind that just shy of a third of that is the nitrogen. So we got to figure out if I'm going to sell this to producers, I've got to figure out, or we've got to figure out a way to take advantage of that nitrogen that's coming through. If we look at that versus the total manure hauling and application costs, I think I had $15 of additional charge if we were nursing something on. We're looking at about $107 an acre, which means compared to commercial fertilizer, we're still $35, $36 in the good, or to the positive side. Now, one of the reasons why I put this together this way is if we don't need sulfur, we can just put a value on the sulfur at 0. If we don't need the phosphorus on the field, we can just put that value at 0. That's not to take away from the nutrient management and the responsible parts of it. But obviously, if I'm talking to somebody who is not going to be buying in phosphate because their fields are at a sufficient range, they're not going to see any value in that. They're not going to be replacing any of their costs. So when we look at it, if we can start to tap into comparing the nutrients in that manure and putting a market value on them, we can compete with that. We can take some of these numbers and we can ship that manure, in this scenario, nearly 20 miles down the road and still have a positive gain, or the user at the other end of that has some benefit. Now, does it strictly come down to that? No, it doesn't. There's concerns that Kevin just laid out prior as far as the pollution potential and other problems. We've got a whole bunch of ground in northwest Mercer County that could use manure, but we can't push manure into that area because nobody wants to smell the manure. So you've got those other issues. So you've got to take those into account. But if we look at strictly the dollar to dollar, we can start to push this manure out and replace a lot of fertilizer with it, even though it's farther and farther away from the farmstead. Those, I guess, that's what I got. I guess what I was looking to you folks is what other kind of considerations need to be built into this? Because what I'm trying to do is build something, a tool, where the manure owner and the crop producer can have a discussion.
What about, and some other people I know worry out here in Washington County, what about satellite storage? Fumes, concrete, whatever truck you go to this time of year, dump off into, now you got a large volume, you can drag line.
That'd be,
I don't know if you got the cost of storage, you can go in there, but over time.
we've got 2 of those in use, and I will tell you that if that's going to be an option, the 2 biggest hurdles that I've had to that is the places where we're using that satellite storage is we've got a common owner between the hogs. The guy that owns the hog farm owns the crop ground over here. They build a satellite storage. It works great. And it's economical because at that point in time, you just added the trucking cost. And a lot of times those guys are using their own labor to drive the truck. They're doing it in the wintertime when there's not as much other things going on. So that's definitely a potential. One of the biggest hurdles to that is if you don't have that situation, the person that's at the other end, the one that owns the ground up there, it'd be the cost of the structure, which is relatively nominal. If you got decent soils, the holding pond itself to service 100 acres would probably be in the range of $10,000 to $12,000 to construct it. So that part of it's not too bad, but it's the social side of it, of a lot of these areas where we'd be trying to send manure, haven't had manure in them a long time. It's going to be the odor, the social side, and I don't want all my neighbors mad at me for doing that. That's the biggest reason why we haven't seen more of it.
But there have been those discussions.
And there have been several other constructions.
Yes.
Good farm have done that probably more before the site.
Sure. Oop. Didn't realize it fell off. What other questions do we have out there? Or comments? What am I looking at wrong? Because
Do you think that if we're doing satellite storages, that we could maybe do something with, like, I know some of the recommendations you'll see is to put like tree buffers or whatever, out of sight, out of mind kind of thing, that for these storage systems are hidden by, let's say, a conifer tree, boundary or whatever, just to kind of keep them out of sight.
my experience has been that out of sight's all well and good, but smell travels through trees awful well. And if they live there, they know it's there anyway. Which it's a start.
Sight and smell together, you just multiply it.
It's a start. But if it were me, and I guess my follow-up comment would be, if it were me thinking about that, I'd spend the money on 15 or 20 tons of straw. I'll go out there in the spring and blow straw out on top of that storage to try to create a crust over that, because a lot of the manures that we have that are going to be high enough in nutrients to make it worthwhile going very far aren't going to form a crust. So my thinking would be is that the formation of that crust and that money would probably be better spent. That'd be my thought.
I mean, you're using an example of lawn manure. I mean, you've got turkeys out there, you've got poultry out there. How do the economics change based on their manure analysis?
The question was, there's several different kinds of manure out there. We've got layer manure, poultry manure, turkey manure. How does the economics compare with that? I'll be perfectly honest, we've got several brokers out in the area. Several of Kevin's CLMs broker poultry manure. In my area, if I got a layer barn, I can dial a phone number and say, hey, you guys come here, haul this out. We can do it between these dates. What do you give me? And it's that simple. I don't even have to lift anything more than a telephone. So there's already an industry or a business to take care of that. It's the liquid side that's the challenge for us as far as trying to make the landowners and the rules all work as one. That's been the challenge. Now, that said, there's more and more potential for some of the dry manures coming out of steers and some of those others to look at. And that's probably my next step in trying to go down this road, would be to do the same thing for some solid manures outside of turkey and chicken, because that's already being supported. Kevin.
Where are you going to have that to get to people?
Where am I going to have that? Well, I'll be perfectly honest. I'm still putting the last touches on it this morning. I don't know. I think Glenn and I will probably try to figure out the best place to put it as far as where to have it available to folks. So it's a work in progress for sure, but we'll get it out there and we'll get it available through some route.
And there's ways to change things. And I'll just give you an example that a commercial applicator, he built his own frac tank, and he can empty 2 semis at a time into the frac tank. And to go 22 miles, he had 11 semis lined up to do it. He found out that when he added a second top loader at the dairy farm so that he could load 2 semis at the same time, he was able to take, I think he thought, 1 or 2 semis out of the rotation. And so what he did on Terry's calculation is his load time, he essentially almost cut that in half because of the 2 semis. Even though it still took him time to load them, it just sped up the speed at which manure left to the dairy farm. And since he had the capability of unloading 2 at the same time at the frac tank at the site, that really helped. Or if you went over to Alger to the large dairy and you see what Walter Manders built a few years ago, he's got a big old vessel on top of a stilts. You pull a semi in there, you pull a lever, and you fill the semi in, he said something like 90 seconds or less. And again, as long as you can do that and not be hauling foam, then you've got a real opportunity to cut minutes out of the calculation. When you cut those minutes out, then your distance you can haul goes up, or at least your cost to haul set distance goes down. So there's ways to work around this that I think this little spreadsheet of Terry's offers a lot of opportunity for people to think through different scenarios.
Is there any other questions or comments?
I'm from Wisconsin, dairy country, and we really worked really hard to try to get some of the manure off the dairies into the cash croppers. And one of the things that we really fight hard with this is the cash croppers just believe all the manure tests are just a bunch of hocus pocus, and they just see this brown water going on in their fields. So it's really hard for some cash croppers to believe that they're getting that fertility. And they think it all goes away, over winter and fall, and, nitrogen leaches away and phosphorus runs away and stuff. They're not getting what they would get if they were supplying fertilizer. So and we have farms that really try hard to sell their manure to cash croppers, and about the most they can get for it is about 40% of the fertilizer.
You and Glenn need to talk after this session because Glenn's got several pictures of manure application the previous fall and what the crops look like the ensuing spring that definitely you can tell that there was an application.
Right.
So,
You don't have to sell me on
Yeah, I know.
but
fertilizer. I'm just saying, that's what we run into with
Yep.
crops. We're trying to convince them that manure is a good fertilizer and can replace the commercial fertilizer provider.
right, but the other side of that is like if I go back to the situation that I'm working with day in and day out, the other side of this whole story is that I think my livestock producers have got to admit to themselves that there's going to still be part of that liability, part of that hauling burden is going to be on them because, the guy out here raising the crops, he's got options. They've got options. They can go to commercial fertilizer. They can do this. They can do that. They've got options. If the rules continue to get stricter and he's out of land, he has no options. That's going to be his liability. So, and that's part of the conversation that's going to take place as we move forward. Any other comments, questions?
Super. Let's thank Terry for helping us out today.